The study of ecology involves looking at the way organisms interact with each other and their environment. Make sure you identify the key words throughout this video and record them on your paper notes. Organisms are divided into two categories based on how they obtain energy. Some organisms are able to absorb energy from the sun through a process called photosynthesis. They are known as autotrophs, or producers, because they produce their own food. The prefix auto means self, and the suffix troph means to obtain energy from food. So autotroph means that organisms are able to obtain energy from food that they make themselves. Plants and some bacteria are able to do this because they have a pigment called chlorophyll that absorbs light energy. Other organisms are unable to do photosynthesis, and they must obtain their energy from consuming other organisms. They are known as heterotrophs, or consumers, because they consume food. The prefix hetero means different, so heterotroph means to obtain energy from a different source. There are 5 types of consumers. The first type is herbivore. Herbivores eat only plants. The prefix herb means plant. Herbivores have a flat, sturdy teeth for grinding and chewing vegetation. Your first key word is interactions. The next type of consumer is carnivore. Carnivores eat only animals. The prefix carne means meat. Carne means sharp. Carnivores have sharp, pointed teeth for hunting prey and tearing into the meat. Omnivores is the third type of consumer. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. You are an omnivore. You have a mix of pointed and flat teeth that are perfect for a mixed diet of plants and animals. Your second key word is in. Another type of consumer is a scavenger. Scavengers eat leftover food that other organisms discard. These organisms have special bacteria in their digestive tract that allows them to eat rotting food sources without getting sick. Vultures are great examples of scavengers. The last type of consumer is decomposer. Decomposers are organisms like fungi, earthworms, and bacteria that break down decaying material and return the nutrients into the soil. Your third key word is ecosystems. Organisms that interact as consumers can be organized into simple food chains. We will use this food chain as an example. The arrows show the direction that energy is moving. So as grasshoppers feed on the plants, they are obtaining the energy from the plant. And as the snake feeds on the snake is obtaining energy from the mouse. So the arrows show direction of energy flow and the organism that's being passed on to the consumer. Energy moves in the direction of the consumer. As you follow the arrow up the food chain, the amount of available energy changes. This is called a trophic level. A really important concept that many students have difficulty remembering is that the sun is the original source of all energy on Earth. The energy that your body is able to get by digesting the cereal you had for breakfast came from the oats and wheat that were harvested to make the cereal. The oats and wheat absorbed that energy from the sun. Producers are considered the first trophic level, or the first organism in a food chain. By the process of photosynthesis, the strawberries and all other plants are able to store energy in glucose molecules. Plants use this stored glucose to continue growing and developing. The next organism in a food chain is called a primary consumer. Primary means first. This is the second trophic level, but the first level of consumers. The organisms that are found on this level are either herbivores or omnivores. Your fourth key word is depend. Depending on what they eat, many organisms can occupy multiple levels of the food chain. Here, the rat can be considered a primary or a secondary consumer. Secondary consumers are organisms that consume a primary consumer. They are the third trophic level, or the third level away from the sun. Secondary consumers must be carnivores or omnivores. Tertiary consumers are considered the top of the food chain or apex species. These organisms consume secondary consumers, so they are usually carnivorous predators. However, they can also be omnivores like humans and bears. The trophic levels on our food chain example stop here, but they can continue on to quaternary consumers. However, there are usually no more than 4 trophic levels because the amount of available energy at these levels would be too small to sustain life. Scavengers and decomposers are still part of the food chain, but do not occupy a trophic level. Decomposers, however, have an important role of returning nutrients to the soil. Plants need these nutrients to grow, so without decomposers, the rest of the food chain would not exist. Your 5th key word is on. In order to use the energy that is transferred along the food chain, all of the organisms, including the producer, transform glucose into a usable form of energy by the process of cellular respiration. You will learn more about cellular respiration in the next unit. It is the opposite process of photosynthesis. Food chains usually overlap within an ecosystem. We use diagrams called food webs to show that certain organisms can occupy multiple trophic levels depending on what they consume. We also use food chains to create diagrams called energy pyramids. Energy pyramids illustrate the transfer of energy between each trophic level. As you go up the pyramid, the amount of energy decreases because you are getting further away from the sun. Energy pyramids also illustrate something called biomass, which is the total biomass of organisms or total amount of organisms at each level. As you travel up the pyramid, biomass also decreases. It takes a large number of producers to provide enough energy to sustain a smaller number of primary consumers, and so on. There are fewer organisms at the top of the pyramid than there are at every other level. Your 6th keyword is various. We're going to get into the interactions between the different types of animals in an ecosystem. First, we'll talk about predation, which is the interaction where one organism kills another organism for food. The organism who is killing is considered the predator, and the organism who is being eaten is considered the prey. Organisms compete for resources like food, water, space, or territory. Competition is the struggle between organisms to survive as they attempt to use the same limited resource. A limiting factor is an environmental condition or resource that limits the size of a population of organisms. Some examples of limiting factors are food and water, which, if there's not enough food and water for all organisms in an ecosystem, then that's going to decrease the amount of organisms that ecosystem can support. There's also weather, accidents, natural catastrophes that could potentially harm the number of organisms that are in the ecosystem, which again would keep the population numbers at bay. Disease, predators, space for habitat are all going to interact with the different species of that ecosystem. Finding mates for different organisms or different species could be difficult depending on how many species or how many different organisms are actually there. And then competition is a big limiting factor where the more organisms there are in one area competing for the same limiting resources are going to make it harder for those organisms to survive. Let's look at the interactions of living things. Symbiosis is a close relationship created between two species due to coevolution, where species evolve together in their environment. This relationship must benefit at least one of the species. There are 3 types of symbiotic relationships. The first is mutualism, which is described as a plus-plus relationship, and this is where both species benefit. So an example would be the clownfish living in the sea anemone, where the clownfish helps keep the sea anemone nice and clean, and the sea anemone provides the clownfish with a home. The buffalo and the tick bird. The tick bird will feed on the ticks on the buffalo, keeping the buffalo happy, and the buffalo is providing a source of nutrients based on the ticks that are feeding on it for the tick bird. The other example is the bumblebee and the flowers, where the bumblebee is getting the nectar from the flowers, and as it lands on the flowers, it's taking up the honey or the nectar It's taking up the pollen on its fur. Then as it goes to land on other flowers, it can pollinate those other flowers. So it's an indirect benefit. Commensalism is the relationship that's described as plus zero. This relationship is where one species benefits and the other species is neither helped nor harmed. So our first example is the Spanish moss and trees, where the Spanish moss is getting nutrients from the trees and the trees are not bothered by the Spanish moss. We also have the shark and remora fish. The shark is going to provide nutrients for the remora fish, as the remora fish is able to suction cup itself to the shark and feed on its leftovers. It also gets a form of transportation from the shark. The shark is not bothered by the remora fish at all. It's pretty interesting. Then we also have the elephant and the egret, where the elephant's not bothered by the egret following it around, but the elephant helps kick up a lot of the different bugs that are in the ground, allowing the egret to get some food source, making it easier for them to find their food source. Our next example is the parasitism relationship, which is described as a plus-minus relationship. This is where one species benefits, which is the parasite, and the other is harmed, which is the host. So one example would be ticks and mammals. So the tick is going to feed on a blood meal from the mammals, and the mammals can be harmed. Depending on the mammal, whether it's a small mammal or a large mammal like us, it could kill or just hurt the animal. The cuckoo birds and bird nests. So here, these birds are going to actually feed on the other birds' eggs, and these birds' eggs are going to not make it, unfortunately. Right? Then we have mosquitoes and mammals, where mosquitoes again are looking for a blood meal from mammals, and mammals are going to be hurt from this because they're the host, but it doesn't necessarily always kill them. All right, your 8th keyword is animal, and your 9th keyword is relationships. So this ends up our presentation on organisms and their interactions in ecosystems. You want to fill out the keyword sentence and then submit your video and move on to the next assignment.